This is Big Podcast.
When you get momentum in podcasting, it is easier to maintain that momentum simply because inertia than it is when you're starting your podcast or you're trying to build your audience. But a podcasting community, podcast listenership, just like any community or audience, it can collapse on itself fairly quickly. So I'm going to talk about that today. What happens when you burn out? What happens when you've got apathy? It's Build a Big Podcast. I'm David Hooper. This is the marketing podcast for podcasters. If you want to grow your podcast, build a bigger audience for your podcast, make a podcast that people care about, make a podcast that matters, make a podcast that makes you money, you are in the right place. Bigpodcast.com. That is the website. That's where you're going to find me. Let's jump in. Podcaster apathy and also burnout. What do you do, man? I've been doing this for a long time. Podcasting, almost 20 years. Started in 2005. I did radio before that. Like most any career of a certain length, there are times when you're hot, and there are times when nobody will put on you if you're on fire. If you're in one of those situations, you are going to relate what I'm saying, because if you stick things out long enough, there'll be times when you're hot, and there'll be times when nobody cares. And there will be times when you're like, I'm ready to give up. I just can't do it. So I'm going to share with you some of the things that I do when I get in situations like this. And one of those things, if you are feeling discouraged about putting episodes out and it seems like you're not getting feedback and it seems like you're not getting downloads and it seems like nobody cares and you're showing up, you're outlining, you're recording, you're editing, you're putting in the work, one of the things that's going to help you is to talk to your audience. People talk about knowing your why, and that's good. But this is the next level of that. This is talking to people that you actually want to reach via your podcast. When you take the time to understand your listeners, what they care about, really get to know them. And this could be via surveys. It could be one-on-one. That's my favorite. It could be via social media. It could be analyzing listener feedback. Personally, I find that engaging because, again, being in the box, which is for me a 5x8 room, it's a tricked out closet. I'm speaking into a mic all by myself. I'm hoping that this message gets out. You're listening to it, so thank you for being on the other end of this. But you never know. And you never know how many people it's going to get out to, because I see download numbers and you see download numbers, but a lot of times we're not talking to those people. I mentioned it on an episode recently that I had an April Fool's joke a few years ago. A little before April, I had laryngitis. My voice was like this. I couldn't talk. But what I did, I said, oh, April Fool's is coming up. I recorded an episode. I'm sorry, I've lost my voice. I'm not going to be able to podcast. The doctor says it's over for me. I'm sorry. I've got to retire from podcasting. I thought it was funny. I thought people would get the joke. They didn't. But one of the things that did happen, and I think this was a positive, is that people came out of the woodwork. Man, I heard that episode. It really connected with people. Again, not in a great way. But people did speak up. And I knew that people were caring. So if you're feeling burnout, if you're feeling like you're about to give up, if you're just apathetic, kind of phoning the episodes in, that's my first thought. Know your audience. I mean, really get to know your audience. That's not just a phrase. Know who you're speaking to. No. Know who you are speaking to. Speak with them one-on-one. And I will say this. If you're doing something in the expert business, like I am, I work with people on podcasts all the time. One of the things that I like to do is have a discount consulting session, a discount call, where I'll get together with somebody, say $99, $100, something like that. Something less than my lower rate. Book out a day and just have conversations. That way, you know, people are going to show up. That way, people are serious about it. That way, people are really engaged. And those are the kind of people that you want to talk to. With that said, I think it's important to talk to a lot of people. So anybody's listening to you, you don't necessarily have to charge them, but the people that you do charge, and it's a good deal for them too, because they're going to show up differently. Those are the people that are really serious. It's not just a pipe dream while they're listening to you. They want to listen to you so they can do something with the information. That might be a way to go. Number 2 on my list, refresh your content. Experiment with different formats, topics, or guest speakers to keep your content fresh and exciting. I've got a book on this. It's called 101 Episode Templates. Right now, you can get it on Amazon. It is 99 cents on Kindle. Paperback, I think it's $8. It is for segments. It is for full-on episodes, and it will give you ideas of different episodes that you can do that aren't what you're doing now. A lot of people do a standard interview. You've got a host, you've got a guest. If you want to add a segment to those standard interviews, this book is full of those things. If you want to try a monologue podcast like this one, most of the time, like this episode anyway, I've got ideas for you to jump into that. Related, I've got something right now called the 30-Day Solo Podcast Challenge. There's still time for you to jump in. If you want to do 30 days of solo podcast, I will guide you through it, give you 30 different exercises. In 30 days, you will be a more competent host. That's a great way to refresh your content. No matter how you do it, though, and this is the big idea, do refresh your content. Q&A sessions, trending topics within your niche, something that's going to allow you to show up in a different way. One of the things I've thought about doing on this podcast, by the way, because I know a lot of podcasters, you might be interested in this if you are a podcaster, and I'm going to assume that you are, is getting together with other podcasters, having a guest co-host where we talk about different topics in the podcasting industry. Like I said, this podcast, mostly a monologue podcast. Monologues are great when it comes to expertise. What they are not great for is background listening. I mean, maybe you're listening to me in the background, but a lot of the times what I'm talking about, do this, do this, do this, do this, there's an action plan. It's not as conversational. It's not as easy to listen to as a co-host, as a guest. So I'm looking at doing that. If you're interested, you can reach out to me, bigpodcast.com. Maybe if I do that, there'll be a spot for you. Third thing, build a community. Online forums, social media, live events. Live events is the big one because you take people offline and you get them to interact with all 6 senses. They can smell people. They can taste something. They can touch. They can feel. They can hear. They can see. Live events are huge. But if you build a community around your podcast, and you probably already have one, make it official in that case. That can be engaging. Because then what happens is you've got people in your community that are using what it is that you're talking about, reacting to what you're talking about. They credit you for giving it to them. And you can see them do something with it on their own. So that can be engaging. You don't have to do all the work. Feel like you have to show up and do an episode. And if you don't, those listeners go away. It doesn't have to work like that. You could have a community where people take the content that you're talking about and then they do something with it. Joe Saul Seahigh from Stacking Benjamins, he does this. He gives financial advice. I don't know if you can technically call it financial advice. Entertainment purposes only. But he's talking about money, and he's got a community of people who like to talk about money with each other. That's great. They do that with his podcast in the center. And he's got other things, a book. He's got live events that he's done. You can build the same thing when you've got a podcast. Fourth thing, consistent engagement. You will hear a lot of podcasters, rate and review. That's not engagement. I'm talking about a two-way conversation. Something beyond your episodes, which are most of the time going to be one way. Social media. Maybe you've got a newsletter where you can feature people in that newsletter, and you can do that in your podcast as well. You've got a blog where people can comment. Behind the scenes content. Something where you're talking to listeners, behind the scenes, maybe non-episode content. Somebody asks about your podcast or what you talk about on social media. You say, hey, can I get on the phone with you, record this? Use this behind the scenes, non-episode content. Yeah. Get 5-10 minutes, do that. Personal stories, not just on your podcast, but your newsletter, social media. Let people get to know you, and in turn, you get to know them. Again, not one way, but two-way. This is one of the reasons that if you listen to broadcast radio, you'll hear jocks ask questions. People call in, they answer that question, and it could be simple. Hey, do you remember your high school prom? What was the theme of your high school prom? Call in right now and let me know. Could be something like that. What was the song that you danced to in high school that you remember the most? Something silly like that. I mean, I say silly, but for some people, if you're Delilah playing love songs and people are taking your content very seriously, you're creating a feeling with listeners. You can do that through questions, and listeners can do that with you by sharing their answers to those questions. It doesn't have to be a phone call. It could be tag me on social media. I will respond to those things. But consistent engagement, whether it's through social media, newsletters, a listener segment, that's going to help you get re-engaged with your podcast, re-engaged with your audience, and avoid burnout because you are part of something. Even if you've got a monologue podcast, you are now having a conversation with people. The fifth thing, and this is the last thing that I'm going to talk about. We're going to keep this short. Seek feedback from your listeners. understand what they like, and understand how they think you could improve something. You don't have to listen to that feedback. You don't have to implement that feedback. You don't have to agree with that feedback. It might not be for you. Sometimes you get feedback on a podcast and they say, you know what you should really do? You should bring in a co-host. And you're like, I really don't want a co-host. I like doing monologues. Or maybe you've got a co-host and somebody says, you know what you should do? You should do monologues. Maybe that feedback that you're receiving, you'll say, no, that's not what I do. But if you start hearing patterns, it is certainly going to tell you what your audience likes. And again, getting connected to your audience, that's going to help you work with what we're talking about. Apathy, burnout, being sick of podcasting and want to go far away from it. I don't want you to be sick of podcasting. You've got an important message. It needs to get out. But you need to take care of yourself. If you need a break, take a break. And if you need to do some of these things to get re-engaged with your podcast, do that. Because you can't fake it. You can pretend to show up, but you can't pretend to care. People are going to know if you care. And we've got a lot of podcasters phoning things in. And we all phone things in from time to time. If you've had that interview, like, I really don't want to do this interview. If you're showing up enough, it happens. But I don't want you to have it happen all the time. I don't want you to think podcasting is not for you. I don't want you to think your podcast is not important because some of these things aren't happening for you. For example, there's no community around your podcast. There's no engagement with the audience. That might not be them. It could be that people are listening. You just haven't engaged with them enough or in a certain way to get them to interact with you. Or you haven't given them a place to have that community where they can talk about the things that you're talking about on your podcast. I want you to fly your flag, and I want you to establish something for your audience. Let's go through these things one more time. One, know your audience, and I mean know your audience. Talk to listeners one-on-one. Really get to know them. And by the way, when I say one-on-one, I'm talking about getting on the phone, getting on Skype, getting on Zoom. Don't do it via social media, 200-something characters at a time. Nope. Have a conversation. Refresh your content. Q&A sessions, segments, listener stories, monologues, co-host, guests. Change it up. I talked about the book that I've got, 101 Podcast Episode Templates. It's available on Amazon right now, 99 cents. Paperback, about $8. That's going to get you thinking. Number 3, build a community. Foster a sense of belonging among listeners. And you do that by having great content, bringing them together on your podcast, then giving them a place to go. Create that space for interaction. Number 4, consistent engagement. That means regular communication with your people that is two-way. Not just you talking, but being in the community. Having a blog post that people can respond to. Having a newsletter that people can respond to. Consistent engagement. Number 5, seek feedback. Now, you're going to get feedback regardless. How about acting like you care? When you let people know that you're open to feedback, even if they don't give you feedback, they appreciate that. That's that interaction. It's you and it's them. Now, if you change something, ultimately up to you, it's your podcast, but it allows listeners to get involved, make suggestions. Maybe you're going to get a good one because we're close to our podcast. Sometimes we need a little bit of distance to really see it for what it is. Those are my thoughts on how to change up podcaster apathy and burnout. If you've got comments, thoughts yourself, reach out to me. BigPodcast.com is how to do that. If you're not subscribed to this podcast at BigPodcast.com, you can do that. BigPodcast.com/subscribe. I've got 3 ways to subscribe. One for iPhone, one for Android, one via an RSS feed. Either way, I will come to you with each and every episode. It is free. You can unsubscribe at any time. There is no pressure. We will still remain friends. So go to BigPodcast.com. You will see the subscribe to the podcast link there. Click on it, and I'll see you on the next episode of Build a Big Podcast.